Bandwagon is basically do it because everybody else is doing. This is a form of peer pressure. It's probably the one that most people are familiar with. It's about, buy those jeans no matter how expensive they are because everybody's doing it. When I was in high school, everybody cuffed the bottom of their straight leg Lees. You had to buy Lees jeans. We wore, Dockers without socks and polos, right? I mean, it was the uniform and everybody wanted to wear that. And so we were all little, replicas of each other. A lot of it was just bandwagon. You did it because, that's what everybody else was doing. And so you have to ask yourself, well, okay, is that enough to make me do that? Right? Just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean that it has merit or that it's actually good. Doesn't mean that it's bad, but you have to look beyond just the idea that we'll do it because everybody else is. Faulty cause and effect. This is also called post hoc ergo propter hoc, if you want the Latin. This is where people try to show a link between events that happen, right? So this happened because of this, right? The problem is that sometimes things happen in a row right after each other that aren't really causally related. They just happen, right? And so it's very easy to fall prey to cause and effect. For example, they give the example of the woman who touched on the Titanic, who touched the button to summon the steward, and Esther, she touched it, there was an explosion, and she was like, oh my God, what did I do, right? I mean, that happens to us all the time. I was doing something on the computer, and I hit a button, and the computer went nuts, and it wasn't what I did at all. It was something else. But my first thought was, oh my God, what did I do? I took my hands off the keyboard and was like, yeah, yikes, right? It was faulty cause and effect, right? You can see here in this third paragraph how it's used, right? For example, a candidate might say, after I came to office, the rate of inflation dropped to 6%, right? Well, just because those two things happened in sequence doesn't mean that one caused the other, right? And so you have to be careful when anytime someone is arguing that something caused something else, you have to say, okay, what are the facts that support that link? Could there be anything else that might have been involved, right? Again, oftentimes events are really complex and they have many different causes, not just one. And so you have to make sure that you're actually identifying the best one, right? False analogy is a comparison. So, or an analogy is a comparison between two ideas, events, or things. But when you're making a comparison or an analogy, the things that you're comparing them have to be significant. So there are many things that we could compare. For example, I could compare my Altima to my cousin's 1972 vintage Corvette with T-tops and chrome pipes, right? They're both cars. They both have doors and headlights, but there's no way that my lovely little Altima is anywhere close to that beautiful 72 vet, right? I have driven that thing, and let me tell you, it is so sweet. You will not mistake yourself in an Altima when you're sitting in a vet. So yeah, there are many similarities, but when it really comes down to it, a vet and an Altima are very different, right? Though they're probably alike in more significant ways than they're not alike. So what you have to do is whenever somebody is trying to compare something to something else, right? Don't get fooled by the things that they tell us are like, and it sounds good because yes, those things are alike. Actually stop and say, okay, but how are they not alike? And are those dissimilarities much more significant than the things that they're alike, right? So for example, years and years ago when we were doing mode writing in Comp 1, we wrote a comparison contrast paper. And I used as an example of a bad paper comparing cats and dogs, right? Cats and dogs are too unalike to make any kind of decent comparison on. Yes, they have two eyes and whiskers and two noses and tails and ears and all of that. But a cat and a dog is a different species, right? They're very different in much more significant ways. And so again, when anybody wants to make a comparison, you have to ask yourself, is it, she says here, analogies can be drawn that are reasonable and fair, right? So we have to ask ourselves, are the things being compared truly alike in significant ways? Do the differences between them affect the comparison? Number 10 is begging the question. As she says, it's a little bit deceptive because there is no question involved. What happens is that our reaction to something that happens begs the question, right? And so it says here, for example, no thinking citizen should approve such a completely unacceptable policy as this one, right? But the problem is, she says, isn't the question of whether or not the policy is acceptable the very point to be established, right? So what happens here is the person assumes is already established the very point that he is trying to prove. So because he hasn't proven that the policy is unacceptable, the argument that no thinking citizen could approve it is what begs the question, but wait a second, who says that it's not acceptable, right? So this is what happens, right? So we have to look for what is assumed in statements. What are they basing their assumption on when they're making this argument? And you have to say, okay, is that reasonable or do you need more proof, right?